I think it's important that schools have a focus on LGBT pupils' mental health and well-being, because we know that LGBT young people experience high rates of poor mental health than their peers. And it's really important that I say this is not because they are LGBT, as in lesbian, gay or bi or trans in and of itself. It's because we know that homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying, language and phobia exist, the family rejection, for example. So all of this has a really strong impact, I think, on people's well-being, but also their sense of belonging in any institution or setting. We did some research in 2017. It's called the Stonewall School Report. And just to give a little bit of a content warning, I'm going to talk about some self-harm and suicide ideation. We know that trans young people were more likely to have self-harmed than lesbian, gay and bi young people. We know that trans young people were more likely to have attempted to take their own life than lesbian, gay and bi young people who weren't trans. And we also know that it's slightly more complicated for children and young people who hold intersectional identity. So lesbian, gay, bi and trans young people who are disabled were more likely to have deliberately harmed themselves than non-disabled LGBT young people. And Black, Asian and minority ethnic LGBT pupils were also more likely to have thought about taking their own life than white LGBT pupils. This isn't a reflection of who they are, but more how society reacts to, sees and supports them is a really important thing, I think, for all schools and settings to take into consideration. We know that not all mental health support is LGBT inclusive and that it should be. We know that all secondary schools should have a trained mental health first aider, but that they might not have thought about the specific needs of the lesbian, gay, bi and trans young people and pupils. We also know that the thresholds for accessing support from CAMHS can be really high. So schools are having to provide some of that support to all of their pupils. A lot of teachers are doing really, really good work on their mental health and on supporting pupils more broadly. It's just about keeping in mind that a lot of the pupils that you might be supporting might identify as lesbian, gay, bi or trans. They may come from families that might have peers that identify that way, and it also might not be the pupils that you suspect or that you know of that identify this way. You've definitely got some recommendations from the Department for Education's guidance, which includes things like schools have a central role to play in enabling their pupils to be resilient and to support good mental health and well-being. The children and young people need it. They need us to be more inclusive in our approach, but also there is a strong legal statutory obligation as well. The Education Inspections Act 2006 means that governing bodies must promote the well-being of pupils at schools, and of course that includes lesbian, gay, bi and trans pupils. Throughout the legislation that exists, there is a real responsibility to make sure that the services you're providing are LGBT inclusive. There's so many ways that mental health fits into the work that schools and settings are already doing. I suppose what I'm asking for is that we think about how they are LGBT inclusive as well. And if the governors aren't asking that question, really you're waiting for a child or young person to say the support that you're providing isn't meeting my needs. And I think we should be more proactive than that. LGBT children and young people experience more bullying. They feel less able to talk to teachers about that specific kind of bullying, because sometimes it can mean that they have to come out, or they might think that that's what they need to do. We also know that that can have a real impact on their sense of belonging in a setting and in the school, whether you can be known by the name that you feel comfortable with, whether you are able to wear a school uniform that you feel comfortable with, whether people get your pronouns right when they meet you. All of these seemingly small things have a really big impact on a child or young person's life and their sense of belonging in a school. And I think those are the challenges, that if you haven't questioned or thought about these things, that can really be a barrier for LGBT children and young people that perhaps we as teachers or governors may not always perceive. During the pandemic, LGBT pupils' mental health and well-being would be exceptionally stressed, I think, because it depends on which spheres or which groups of people they feel comfortable being themselves in, if they have any. For some LGBT children and young people, being at school is the place that they feel safe and can come out and be themselves. For others, that might be at home. For others, it's a youth group. And all of these settings have changed so much in the past few months, and the degree to which you feel able to be yourself when you're engaging with online classes, for example, might be different. Society hasn't quite grasped how to be thoroughly inclusive, and so without meaning to, sometimes we create things that are LGBT phobic. Unless a child or young person tells us about it, we haven't thought about how we can make things more inclusive. I think the governing board's role in making sure that LGBT pupils feel valued and safe as part of the school community is so important, because anecdotally, and it is anecdotal, but governors think that their school is more LGBT inclusive than their students do, and they think that it is a safer place for their students than the students do. So that difference in opinion really throws me. So think about, what is it that we can do as a governing board that would check that our assumptions are in line with how a child or young person actually feels in our setting in school. So I'd really suggest finding out what your students and their families' experience of school life. One thing that really interests me about primary schools is that it's not just the pupils who might identify as lesbian, gay or bi or trans who experience homophobic bullying in language. It's any child or young person who defies gender stereotypes. So the girl who's good at sport and the boy who isn't, for example. Even the pupils who don't identify as LGBT will be experiencing some level of homophobic bullying. That's why for governors it's also so important to make sure that you're recording all prejudice-related incidents and keeping an eye on them. So homophobic, biphobic, transphobic. And if you do that, you'll have an insight. And then I think you want to find out more than just bullying rates of incidents your staff are aware of, really. Another awesome way of doing that is just to work with your school council. Ask them if they've been running campaigns on Anti-Bullying Week, and if they have, what they think about homophobic, biphobic, transphobic bullying in language and setting. If they think that an LGBT pupil would feel safe and comfortable in that school. Children and young people are just amazing. The minute they explain that someone has two dads who love each other very much, and that's basically what gay means, that they're totally fine with it. So I think a lot of it is about us doing the unlearning, really. But definitely ask your children and young people. For more resources and support, I definitely suggest coming to the Stonewall website. We've got a terminology, we've got lesson plans, we've got loads of guidance, everything from working with a school council to activities that you can do for Anti-Bullying Week. Our job is to make LGBT inclusion slip into the things that you're already doing and to make sure that you're best supporting all children and young people to be themselves. The schools that do LGBT inclusion really well take their responsibilities from the Equality Act very seriously. And they do this by not only embedding LGBT inclusion into anti-bullying, they also embed it into their relationship, sex and health education, but also the curriculum more broadly. It's not enough to know that saying gay in a derogatory way isn't a good thing and shouldn't be done. It's not even enough to know that, you know, a couple can love each other as two men, and that's totally valid. I think we need to see more representation throughout the curriculum, and there are loads of schools that do this already and really well. I want to see pictures of LGBT people and their successes, and not just the fact that they're LGBT. I want to see Frida Kahlo in your art lessons and Alan Turing in your maths lessons, and LGBT is just one part of who these people are, but you also explore all their fantastic achievements and how far we have come as a society. And I think this is where you see LGBT inclusion done really well. But most importantly, a school that does LGBT inclusion well, you feel it. The children and young people are able to be themselves. Parents want to bring their kids to your school. And what makes everybody different is respected and celebrated. And that's the true magic, I think, about LGBT inclusion. As soon as you celebrate what makes people different, you're not actually just having a conversation about lesbian, gay, bi and trans people, families, communities. You're talking about all the things that make all of us different and celebrating it.